Have you ever destroyed something you loved without even realizing it? Not with your hands, but with your silence, your laughter, your indifference? Horror isn't always the stuff of nightmares. It's not lurking monsters or rattling chains. Sometimes it's quieter. It creeps in through choices we don't question, through whispers we don't challenge, and through harm we pretend isn't ours to own. This is the story of Eli, a soul so full of light that the world dimmed it, one cruel act at a time. He wasn't broken all at once. It happened in fragments. The taunts, the stares, the suffocating silence. Every piece stolen wasn't just his, it was ours. It was mine. I thought I was innocent. I thought staying quiet was safe. But silence isn't safety, it's complicity. And now his absence is here with me. It watches, it whispers. It reminds me of the monster I became when I chose the comfort of the crowd over the courage to stand alone. You think you know horror? So did I. But nothing could prepare me for the weight of his shadow or the truth it forced me to carry. This is my confession. It's the story of Eli and the cracks guilt carved into my soul. It's the story of what I became and why I'll never escape it. Are you ready to face this truth? Because I wasn't. And here's the question I'll leave with you. If it were your choice, would you be any different? I grew up in a world where lessons didn't need words. Hate wasn't something people shouted in the streets. It was passed down in glances, in the way people looked away, and in the unspoken rules everyone followed without question. As a child, I didn't question it either. I absorbed it, like air filling my lungs. And then, there was Eli. He wasn't like the others. He didn't hide behind a hardened shell or carry the bitterness I saw in so many faces. Eli was kind in ways that made you stop and notice, a rare warmth in a world that taught people to stay cold. He helped anyone, even those who barely acknowledged his existence. But none of that mattered to the people around me. It didn't matter to me. All I let myself see was the one thing they told me mattered most, the color of his skin. There's one day I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. Eli stood there, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the ground. The taunts came sharp and fast, cutting through the air like shards of glass. Cruel names, crueler laughter. Everyone joined in, even me. I laughed, not because I thought it was funny, but because it was easier than standing apart. It was safer than standing with him. Inside, I felt something stir, a faint, trembling voice whispering, "This isn't right." But I smothered it. I buried it under fear, under conformity, under the lie that standing with the crowd was better than standing alone. Eli didn't fight back. He didn't shout or cry. He just stood there, shrinking under the weight of our words. His silence screamed louder than anything he could have said, and even then I knew, deep down, I knew we were breaking him. There was a moment when his eyes met mine, just for a second, and in that second I felt it, shame, guilt, fear. But I looked away. I told myself it wasn't my problem, because it wasn't just me, was it? It was everyone. That's what I told myself to sleep at night. But the truth? The truth was that every word I laughed at, every time I turned away, I wasn't just part of the crowd. I was part of the hate. Looking back, it's so clear now. We didn't just hurt him. We erased him, piece by piece, day by day. And every laugh, every silence, every cruel moment, I let it happen. Eli's suffering didn't start with strangers or the world outside. It started with me. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes, haunted, pleading, empty. It's a look I still see when I close my own. Because even then, I knew what I was doing, and I chose to do nothing. At first, the changes in Eli were subtle. Averted eyes, a slightly hunched posture, smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. He still tried to help, to laugh, to exist in a world that seemed determined to push him out. But over time, that light of his, the one that made him so different, so extraordinary, began to fade. The laughter around him grew louder, sharper. The jokes weren't just cruel, they were weapons, wielded by people who had convinced themselves that it was all harmless fun. But it wasn't harmless, it never was. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that it wasn't my responsibility. But I could see the truth in every small change in Eli. The way he started walking a little faster to avoid the crowds. The way he sat alone, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for another blow. The way his voice grew quieter, as though speaking up wasn't worth the effort anymore. I remember one day in particular. Eli was sitting on a bench, his head down, his fingers picking nervously at the edge of his shirt. He looked so small, so weighed down, like the world had taken every ounce of joy he had left. His eyes stared out at nothing, empty and distant. I stood there, frozen. I told myself I should go over, say something, do something. But my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. My mind was a storm of excuses. What can I say? What difference will it make? It's not my fault. It's not just me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Every cruel word chipped away at him, every whisper carved into his spirit, every laugh erased another part of who he was. And every moment I stayed silent, every time I looked away, I helped destroy him. It wasn't just the taunts that broke Eli. It was the silence. The way we treated him like he wasn't even there, like he didn't matter. It was the isolation that came from all of us deciding in a million small ways that he didn't belong. Eli was strong, stronger than I could ever have been. But even the strongest person can only carry so much. And one day he stopped carrying it. He stopped trying. He stopped being. The vibrant, kind-hearted man I once knew had become a shadow, a hollow shell of who he used to be. And I let it happen. Every time I ignored that voice inside me, the one that screamed, "This isn't right," I made a choice. I chose comfort over courage. I chose to let someone else suffer so I wouldn't have to. The guilt didn't hit me all at once. It crept in, slow and insidious, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. But even then, I could feel it. A weight I couldn't name, an ache I couldn't escape. Eli couldn't escape either. His torment wasn't just in his body, it was in his mind, his spirit, his very soul. And I stood by and watched it happen, telling myself the same lie over and over. It's not my fault, but it was, it always was. The day I heard Eli was gone, I already knew. Before anyone said the words, before the whispers made their way to me, I felt it, a hollow ache deep in my chest. It was the kind of pain you don't question because you know exactly what it means. Eli was dead. He didn't leave a note. There were no explanations, no final words to give us closure. Just a quiet exit from a world that had taken everything from him, piece by agonizing piece. And yet somehow it didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable. Like the tragic final act of a play we'd all been performing in for years. At first I clung to the lies I'd been telling myself. It wasn't my fault. He was just weak. Maybe this was always going to happen. But those excuses, they crumbled the moment I tried to hold on to them. Because the truth was staring me in the face. Eli wasn't weak. He was stronger than any of us. He survived far longer than most could under the crushing weight of our cruelty. But even the strongest have their breaking point. It wasn't the bruises or the scars that killed him. It was the relentless loneliness, the suffocating silence, the constant reminders that he didn't belong. Every cruel word, every averted glance, every laugh chipped away at his soul until there was nothing left. And I helped do that to him. The funeral was unbearable, not because of the grief, though that was there, heavy and oppressive, but because of the faces around me. Faces filled with regret, with sadness, but not with responsibility. Everyone acted as if this tragedy had come out of nowhere, like they hadn't seen it coming, like they hadn't been part of the reason Eli was gone. But I had seen it coming. We all had. We just didn't want to admit it. When the numbness wore off, the guilt began to settle in. At first, it was quiet, like a faint whisper at the edge of my mind, but it grew louder, heavier, until it was all I could hear. And then, I started to see him. It began as flashes, his face in the corner of my eye there and gone before I could convince myself it wasn't real. A shadow lingering too long, a faint voice calling my name in the stillness of the night. I told myself it was just my mind, playing tricks on me. Grief, guilt, stress, it had to be. But the signs didn't stop. They became sharper, clearer, impossible to ignore. The worst was the mirror. Every time I looked into it, I didn't just see myself. I saw him, his eyes staring back at me, not with anger, but with something far worse. Pain. A quiet, unending pain that seemed to seep into me, wrapping around my chest like a vice. Eli wasn't just gone. He was here, always here. Not as a ghost haunting the world, but as the shadow haunting me. And that's when I realized the most terrifying truth of all. Eli's torment didn't end with his death. It had only just begun, because now it wasn't him who was haunted. It was me. For a while, I thought I could move on. I thought Eli's death was the end of his story and mine. A tragedy, yes, but one I could bury like so many other uncomfortable truths. But guilt isn't something you bury. It grows like a shadow that stretches longer with the setting sun. At first it was subtle, a faint whisper in the stillness of the night. One word, why? It was soft, barely audible, but it wrapped around me like smoke, clinging to my thoughts. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Grief, stress, a bad dream. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. And soon they weren't just words, they were memories. I started seeing Eli in the edges of my world. A shadow in my periphery, a fleeting reflection in a window, a presence I could feel but not quite name. And then there were the mirrors. Every time I looked into one, I didn't just see myself, I saw him. His face wasn't angry or vengeful. It was worse. It was hollow, broken, filled with a pain so deep it felt like it could pull me under. His eyes stared back at me, not accusing but pleading. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining things, but no amount of logic could silence the whispers or erase the image of Eli's haunted gaze. It wasn't just at night. He seeped into my days too. I'd hear his voice in the wind, faint and fleeting, but unmistakable. I'd feel his presence in empty rooms, the air heavy and suffocating. No matter where I went, he was there. But it wasn't anger I felt from him. It was something worse. It was pain. A deep, unrelenting pain that seemed to bleed into me, wrapping around my chest, my thoughts, my soul. He made me relive everything. Every cruel laugh, every moment I stayed silent, every time I looked away. But it wasn't just my perspective anymore. I saw it through his eyes. I felt his humiliation. His isolation, the crushing weight of being erased by the people around him. I became him. I felt the eyes staring at me, the laughter ringing in my ears, the suffocating loneliness that wrapped itself around me like a shroud. Every word, every sneer, every second of rejection, it was mine now. I started questioning everything. Was this just my guilt, my mind tearing itself apart? Or was Eli truly here, making me feel what I had refused to see when he was alive? I couldn't tell anymore. The line between reality and memory blurred until I was trapped in an endless loop of fear, regret, and despair. Eli wasn't haunting me out of vengeance. He didn't need to. He was haunting me to make me understand, to force me to see the pain I had helped create, to make me live it. I thought I could escape him. But you can't outrun the ghosts you create. And Eli? He was never really gone. He was always there, waiting. You think you know guilt? That it's just a heaviness in your chest, a voice whispering, you were wrong. That's what I thought too at first. But guilt doesn't just sit with you. It consumes you. It twists everything you know, everything you are, until you can't tell where it ends and you begin. At first I thought that's all it was, guilt. A natural consequence of what I'd done or failed to do. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't just the memories that haunted me, though they came back with a cruel clarity I couldn't escape. Every laugh, every sneer, every moment I chose silence over courage. They were sharper now, like shards of glass cutting into my mind. But they weren't just my memories anymore. They were his. I began to see the world through Eli's eyes. I felt what he felt, the sting of humiliation, the suffocating loneliness, the endless ache of being unseen. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real. I was standing in his shoes, feeling every wound I had helped inflict. The weight of the stairs, the laughter that echoed in my ears like a cruel symphony, the silence that pressed down on my chest, heavier than any words could have been. I couldn't escape it. Not during the day, not at night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was there again, in his place, living his pain. The worst moments came in the mirrors. They became my enemy. Every reflection showed me Eli's eyes, those haunted, pleading eyes, staring back at me. They weren't angry, they weren't accusing, they were hollow, filled with a pain so deep it seemed endless. I began to avoid mirrors, but it didn't matter. He was everywhere. At night, I would wake gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My room would feel colder than it should, and I'd feel it. The weight of his presence, heavy and suffocating. Sometimes I'd see him standing at the foot of my bed, silent and still. He didn't need to speak. His pain spoke louder than words ever could. And then there were the dreams. Or were they memories? I couldn't tell anymore. I would see him, standing in the distance, his back to me. I'd call his name, but my voice wouldn't come. When he turned, his face was a twisted reflection of pain and despair, and I'd wake up choking on the weight of it. It wasn't just fear I felt. It was understanding. He wasn't showing me these things to hurt me. He didn't have to. He was showing me because I needed to see, I needed to feel. This wasn't just guilt, it was punishment. He wasn't just haunting me. He was unmaking me piece by piece. The person I thought I was, the person I wanted to believe I was, couldn't survive under the weight of this truth. I thought I could run from it. I thought I could convince myself it wasn't real. But there's no escape from this kind of horror. Because Eli's pain wasn't something he left behind when he died. It's mine now, and I carry it with me every second of every day. I thought guilt was just a whisper, but guilt, real guilt, is a rule. And it doesn't stop, it doesn't fade, it doesn't let go. Eli didn't need to haunt me to punish me. He just needed me to understand, and now I do. I understand that I'm not just haunted by him, I'm haunted by the person I let myself become. Have you ever stood face to face with the person you destroyed? Not just seen their pain, but felt it? Felt it in a way that tears through your defenses and leaves you exposed, raw and broken? I didn't want to face Eli again. I thought I could bury the memories, silence the whispers, and pretend his absence was just a chapter I could close. But the truth doesn't stay buried. It waits. And that night, it found me. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. The room was silent, but it wasn't empty. I felt him before I saw him, his presence pressing down on me like a storm about to break. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at a face I barely recognized. My eyes were hollow, my skin pale, and the weight of my guilt was carved into every line. I didn't even flinch when the glass cracked, splintering outward as if the truth was forcing its way in. And then he was there. Not a reflection, not a shadow. Eli. He didn't look like the man I remembered. His face was worn, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen. But it wasn't anger I saw in them. It was worse. It was pain. A pain so deep, so unrelenting, it felt like it could pull me under. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. He didn't have to say anything for me to feel the full weight of what I'd done. But then he spoke, and his words cut deeper than any accusation ever could. "Look at me," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "Do you see what you did?" I tried to look away, but I couldn't. His eyes held me there, forcing me to see the cracks I had helped carve into him. "You think you were innocent?" he continued. "You laughed with them. You stayed silent. You watched me break, and you did nothing. Do you feel it now? The hate, the shame, the pain? It's yours now." I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. What could I possibly say? That I was sorry? That I didn't mean for it to happen? That I was just scared? None of it mattered. His presence grew heavier, colder, like the room itself was collapsing in on me. He took a step closer, and with each step the memories came flooding back. His laughter turned hollow, his eyes turned vacant, his light extinguished by the weight of everything we'd done to him. "You thought you were safe," he said, his voice breaking. "You thought silence would protect you. But silence destroys. And now, you'll carry this, just like I did." I wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but his gaze silenced me, because I knew he wasn't wrong. The mirror behind him shattered completely, fragments scattering across the floor, each piece reflecting a memory I'd tried to bury. The laughter, the whispers, the moments I turned away, they stared back at me through every shard, impossible to ignore. And then Eli stepped closer, so close I could feel the cold radiating from him. His voice dropped to a whisper, but it was louder than anything I'd ever heard. "Do you understand now?" And I did. I understood that my silence wasn't just cowardice, it was complicity. My indifference wasn't harmless, it was violence. Eli didn't need to touch me, didn't need to scream at me, because the truth he carried was heavier than anything else. And now that truth was mine to bear. He turned and walked away, but his presence didn't leave with him. The air was still cold, the weight still crushing, the pain still alive. And I knew in that moment that this was my punishment. Not vengeance, but understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't let you sleep, that doesn't let you breathe. Because the worst kind of horror isn't the ghost you see. It's the reflection of the monster you became.